April 2nd, 1917, 01:45 at Souchez Valley, France. Private John Pattison checks the last fuse on his Mills bomb while frost hardens the duckboards under his boots. 30 men flatten against the revetment, 30 faces blackened with soot, 30 breaths, white in the dark. A runner taps 2 fingers. Go. By dawn, a kilometer of German front is awake, panicked and bleeding. A rumor spreads down the line faster than the truth. Canadians. The numbers say the shelling did the damage. The whispers say 30 did. What happens when a handful of disciplined raiders become the operating system of a corps? What happens when that corps teaches an entire army how to turn minutes into shock, shock into surrender, and surrender into momentum? By April 1917, German intelligence had a name for it. The Canadians were the British Empire's storm troops. They were not many. But in the night, 30 felt like 10,000. By January 1915, the infant Canadian Corps was learning the Western Front the way all new formations did, under fire, in mud, with notebooks open. The Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry reached the line near Ypres thin on experience, but thick with pre-war militia discipline. They learned the drill: duck at whiz, ignore at plop, count the seconds for crump. They learned the trench map grid, the trench routine, and then the thing that mattered more than routine, the raid. A raid was not an assault. It was intrusion as method. Slip into the enemy trench, kill or capture, rip up wire, blow a dugout, drag back a prisoner for interrogation, and slip out before the barrage returned the favor. Distinguish a raid from a reconnaissance by the souvenirs it brings home. A prisoner with a regimental number, a diary, a unit stamp on a paybook, the fresh intelligence that tells a staff officer exactly who sits opposite whom. Raids started small, 10 to 20 men. The Canadians scaled them. Company-sized thrusts, 80, 100, sometimes more, became rehearsed performances with taped-out trenches behind the lines, hand-picked bombers, and leaders briefed on second-by-second timelines. But within those larger actions, the old unit of currency remained, the 30-man party. 3 sections, a leader, 2 men with wire cutters, 4 bombers, Lewis gun team, moppers up with pistols and clubs, a covering team to post at the sap head. A 30 that functioned like a precision tool. By April 22, 1915, at 2nd Ypres, the Canadians were tested differently. A wall of green gas rolled across French colonial positions and opened a yawning gap in the line. The Canadians, breathing through urine-soaked cloths and instinct, counterattacked with line-of-sight violence. They held Kitchener's Wood with bayonets and steadiness. What they lacked in masks, they made up for in tempo. The message for the rest of the war was embedded in that night. If the line breaks, move toward the danger. If the schedule fails, improvise forward. The Canadian Corps changed leaders and doctrine. Lieutenant General Julian Byng took command in 1916. His chief of staff, Major General Arthur Currie, methodical, unsentimental, relentless about training, turned raiding from a nocturnal sport into a laboratory. Practice trenches sprang up, sections rehearsed in daylight what they would do at night. Maps multiplied. Sand tables grew dense with string and pins. A raid became a miniature battle with logistics and timing, and a 30-man party became the sharp edge of the experiment. By the winter of 1916 to 1917, opposite Vimy Ridge, trenches and tunnels like capillaries fed the Canadian line. Mines blew, craters merged, and the chalk cliffs held a secret that artillery alone couldn't solve. A ridge defended by depth, by belts of wire, by machine guns, sighted to slice across any advance. Direct assault promised casualties the Corps could not replace. But night could make local superiority out of small numbers. Night could create shock. In one sector near Thelis, a 30-man party stepped off at Euro 130. 2 cutters went first, with sacking over their shoulders to lay across the wire. Bombers followed carrying 2 Mills bombs each, a 3rd man with spare fuses and lighters. They counted steps, 20 to the first belt, 15 to the sap, 8 down the bay. They moved on a whispered clock, wire cut by the 25th minute, the sap head blocked by the 30th, dugout doors wedged by the 35th. At minute 38, a German NCO emerged half-dressed and blinked into a pistol muzzle. He talked quickly. His shoulder strap told the rest. A reserve replacement battalion from Württemberg had rotated in. Fresh troops, new officers, different habits at stand to. The intelligence officer took notes. The staff filed the pattern. The Corps revised the artillery program for the full assault scheduled for April 9th. Raid after raid told the same story. 30 in the night could extract more value than 1,000 at noon. The exchange rate of fear favored the raider. A German platoon commander could shrug at a daylight shelling, impersonal, statistical, survivable if he kept his head down. But 30 Canadians creeping through the wire meant the terror of contact, the bang and shout and sudden flare, the dugout door heaving against a wedge, and the short second of understanding before a grenade sailed in. It is one thing to be shelled. It is another to hear someone breathing in your trench and know he is not yours. By March, a myth formed around a method. The myth said Canadians fought mean. The method said they fought rehearsed. Night raids trained the reflexes of entire battalions. Move in teams, keep intervals, don't bunch at obstacles, clear to depth, mark the path home. The muscle memory built at night was the same muscle memory Vimy would demand at dawn. April 9, 1917, 5:30, 0 hour. Snow in the air, gun flashes burning white on the ridge. The Canadian Corps stepped off behind a creeping barrage calibrated by stopwatch and map square. The advance wasn't a wave. It was 1,000 small raids moving at once, 30 by 30 by 30, each with a timetable, each with a limited objective. It worked because the men had already done the action pattern in miniature for months. Enter, clear, consolidate, hand off to the next line. The ridge fell in hours where it had resisted for years. But the fear the Canadians inspired wasn't born at Vimy. It matured after, in set-piece assaults, and in the grind between them, through a repeatable pattern that gave 30 men disproportionate power. 3 elements combined: information, violence at the point of contact, and time compression. Information. Raid prisoners and papers taught the Canadians who sat opposite which reliefs were late, which batteries were low on shells, which sections of wire were neglected. German diaries recorded fatigue, shortage, and guesswork. Canadian staff turned that into schedules. If a sector slept deeply at 02, raid it then. If wiring parties got sloppy right before dawn, strike at 4:50. 30 became feared because 30 knew where to go. Violence at the point of contact. A 30-man party could concentrate more destructive force per meter of trench than a battalion spread over frontage. Hand grenades were the currency of trench interiors. The Canadians spent freely. Bombers carried 4, 6, sometimes 8 Mills bombs tucked in satchels. Each bay of trench could receive 1 or 2 before anyone inside understood what was happening. Clubs, pistols, trench knives did ugly work up close. A Lewis gun posted at an angle swept the traverse behind. The shock of entry became predictable and then inevitable. Time compression. Raids turned minutes into events. A battery's counterfire lagged behind by 2 or 3 minutes. A German sentry's alarm might take 1 minute to travel down a line. If the Canadians could run the script, wire cut by minute 8, trench entered by minute 10, first dugout neutralized by minute 12, second by minute 15, then everything after was exploitation. 30 men could do 30 minutes of damage in the space of 10 if the timings held. Fear grew from the sense that once the Canadians were inside your wire, everything accelerated, including your odds of dying. By August 1917, at Hill 70 near Lens, Arthur Currie had his first command of the whole Corps. He engineered a battle whose objective wasn't ground for its own sake, but the destruction of German formations sent to counterattack. The trick was to take just enough of the hill to force a response, then kill the response with layered artillery and machine guns. Night work beforehand, screening raids, prisoner snatches, wire cutting, had mapped the exact friction points. 30-man parties laid this foundation. When the attack went in on August 15th, Canadian units seized the crest, then watched as predictable enemy countermoves churned forward into mapped killing zones. Ammunition had been carried up by rehearsed carrying parties, water and stretcher routes marked and practiced. The Corps didn't rely on inspiration. It relied on systems, each served by small teams that behaved like those 30-man raiders, task-focused, timed, aggressive. Germans who had dismissed trench raiding as a nuisance now felt that same quick, suffocating tempo at the scale of a division. The outcome confirmed the thesis of the raids. Move fast, compress time, and make the other side react inside your rhythm. Fear amplified results. At Lens, after a Canadian patrol slipped behind a machine gun post in the dark, a nervous German platoon abandoned a stronger position 100 meters away without orders. Panic spreads along trenches the way flames spread along a fuse. Men don't run from bullets, they run from what they cannot see. 30 Canadians seldom killed as many as an hour of shelling, but they cracked the seal of composure, and once the seal broke, larger units often ran. Anecdote over data can mislead, but here the micro matched the macro. On August 8, 1918, Amiens, the Canadians advanced with Australians in one of the war's most successful set-piece attacks. The Fourth Army grabbed kilometers in a day. The numbers were staggering: thousands of prisoners, hundreds of guns, frontline units shattered. Yet scratch the surface and you see the same small unit discipline scaled through an entire corps. Tanks, aircraft, and artillery mattered. So did deception and secrecy. But dozens of 30-man patrols in the nights before, cutting wire, taping routes, wiping out pickets, primed the sector for collapse. When the assault started, German companies expecting routine harassing fire instead found coordinated shock rolling through at speed. The day became what the German High Command called the Black Day, not only because they were beaten, but because they were beaten inside their decision cycle. Raid logic had become battle logic. There were names behind the method. Captain Tane McDowell at Vimy bluffed and fought through machine gun nests, capturing dozens with 2 runners. Sergeant Thomas Dynesen, a Danish-born volunteer in the 42nd Battalion, cut through at Parvillers, stabbing and bombing his way across trench bays with the same economy of motion he had trained 100 times. Lance Corporal William Metcalf crawled under wire to wave an attack forward under fire at Vimy, an action as simple as a hand signal and as consequential as a barrage. And always, woven through battalions, were the snipers, the most patient distillate of the raid ethos. Men like Francis Pegamagabau, who stalked as much as he shot, feeding intelligence as much as terror. Each name marked an individual feat. Together they were proof of a culture that rewarded initiative at the 30-man scale. The German reaction evolved. In 1916, their answer to raiding was to harden trench nodes, more wire, more concrete, more interlocking fire. By 1917, they moved toward elastic defense, pulling back from the forward zone and trading ground for time, not unlike the way they absorbed the Verdun assault. But the Canadians' 30-man parties didn't need a fixed line to bite. They took prisoners in outposts and saps. They ambushed wiring parties. They murdered routine wherever they found it. When the Germans pulled back to the Hindenburg Line, the Canadians followed the logic rather than the location. 30 didn't require elaborate geography. 30 required the opportunity to compress time and apply violence where routines made men vulnerable. The cost was real. Raids bled men in constant drips, 1 killed by a flare popping at the wrong moment, 3 wounded by a bomb bursting short, a corporal left behind in the confusion. There were failed raids where timings gone wrong turned 30 men into a tangle of bodies in the wire. A winter raid in early 1917 went out in heavy snow, got lost, and stumbled into an alerted post. It returned with fewer than half. The method created fear and gathered intelligence, but it also put volunteers in the sharpest part of the meat grinder. Curry understood the ledger. He demanded raids that paid in intelligence or preparation for named operations, not raids for their own sake. The Corps institutionalized restraint inside aggression. Practice more, brief more, cancel if the wind shifted wrong. You cannot be feared for long if you waste men for short applause. So where did the "more feared than 10,000" line come from? It emerges first as a battlefield rumor, German prisoners saying they feared the Canadians like they feared no one else, British soldiers trading stories that the Canadians did at night, what whole divisions couldn't do by day. Then it resolves into a measurable effect. At Lens, a German regiment held back beyond its assigned start line during a counterattack because it believed the Canadians had infiltrated further than they had. At Amiens, German forward posts surrendered early in the barrage because small Canadian teams appeared behind them in the mist, a trick possible only because those teams had practiced the approach a dozen times in darkness. At the Drocourt-Quéant line, Canadian parties moved on pillboxes, not as mobs, but as rehearsed groups of 30 or fewer, taking out flanks and doors, while the barrage lifted with metronomic precision. An enemy who believes small numbers can be anywhere will treat those numbers like a mass. Fear is not a mystical property. It is a function of expectation multiplied by consequence. The 30-man party changed expectation that your trench at night is yours. It changed consequence that if it is not, your life expectancy shrinks to seconds. Multiply those two, and 30 becomes a force multiplier. 10,000 men can hold a front. 30 men can make a front feel porous. Make a line feel porous often enough, and the next set-piece attack will move through it faster than your orders can catch up. The Canadian Corps didn't corner the market on raiding. Australians raided, New Zealanders raided, British regulars raided, Germans raided back with equal skill. But the Canadian blend, raiding plus rehearsal, rehearsal plus doctrine, doctrine plus leadership that rewarded initiative, gave the 30 a density of effect unusual, even in a war of specialists. That effect showed up in more than casualty lists. It showed in captured documents, testifying to battalion morale collapsing in sectors where night never felt safe, in desertions rising before major Canadian assaults, in the defensive schedules shifted to account for Canadian methods. Fear became a logistics variable. If you assign an extra machine gun team to a quiet sector because Canadians, that team isn't elsewhere. By November 1917 at Passchendaele, the ground itself seemed to conspire against the 30. Mud swallowed footprints and men, raids became slogs, and stealth died under a brown skin of water. Yet even there, the method adapted. The 30 became carrying parties in darkness, laddering duckboards and ammunition to keep any advance from starving. Where night fighting failed, night logistics took over. The Canadian reputation, earned in raids, now fed morale in the worst conditions. Men who had practiced risk by night carried nerve into daylight battles that offered few other advantages. The Ridge, ugly and meaningless as a map feature, fell because formations with practiced small units paused less and consolidated faster. The middle of 1918 flipped the battlefield. Germany's spring offensives ripped open fronts, Allied lines bent and reeled. When they stiffened and then counterattacked, the Canadians weren't many, but they were mobile. The same 30 that raided by night now patrolled by day, probing for weak points in a fluid fight. The same leaders, sergeants and lieutenants who had timed themselves against watchdials, now sang inside the clock of a rolling advance. Consolidate, leapfrog, push posts forward, keep the enemy guessing where the next bite would come. In a war that grew steadily more mechanized, the Canadians' human algorithm still mattered. Fear lets you pass through defenses faster. Speed denies the enemy the time to build more. The climax isn't a single night raid or a single dawn. It's the moment when the German assessment of the Canadians shifts from irritation to dread, when a sector commander spends a grudging meeting explaining to his superiors why his battalion failed to stand because he was facing stormtroops. The label mattered less than the behavior it tagged, disciplined aggression. At Amiens, at the Drocourt-Quéant line, on the approaches to Cambrai, the shorthand, "It's the Canadians," did operational work. A staff officer who writes those words into a briefing authorizes extra wire, extra guns, extra reserves. If he is wrong, he wastes resources. If he is right, he admits that small numbers of trained men can command disproportionate attention. 30 become feared because they become a factor in enemy plans. By October, with the war's end approaching, the Canadian Corps took Valenciennes in a crisp operation that combined intelligence, surprise, and limited objectives. The raid logic scaled. A river obstacle that might have delayed a less practiced force for days fell in hours. Fire was suppressed, crossings were rehearsed, timings held. Civilian lives in the town were saved because a force that had learned to move precisely by night could move precisely in daylight under pressure. Fear no longer mattered. By then, the Germans were losing. But the method still paid in fewer dead and quicker results. The thesis resolves into a single line. 30 Canadian soldiers, trained, rehearsed, timed, and led, could produce the fear effect of 10,000 by altering the enemy's expectation of safety and the timeline of response. The resolution sits in the ledger. The Canadian Corps paid with men whose names appear on cenotaphs across a continent. The value they delivered was not only ground taken or prisoners counted. It was a pattern of action that shortened some battles, spared some civilians, and made the enemy's calculations less reliable. Numbers on paper, divisions, guns, shells, tell one story. The 30 tell another, that in a system as vast as the Western Front, precision mattered as much as mass. Decades later, veterans remembered the raids with a blend of pride and unease. Pride because they felt agency. Men chose to go, trained to go, and went. Unease because the work was intimate. The distance between throwing a grenade into a dugout and listening to the outcome is short. The distance between being feared and becoming fear's instrument is shorter. Those who survived carried both. Return to Souchez, April 2nd, 1917, 01:45. 30 men slip through a gap that didn't exist the day before. A sentry dies without waking. Another wakes without fighting. A dugout surrenders not because it must, but because it has rehearsed this outcome in rumor. The party leaves with 2 prisoners and papers wrapped in oilcloth. It leaves also with a rumor that travels in the opposite direction, that Canadians are everywhere at night and nowhere else is safe. When the bombardment falls 7 days later and the Corps goes over the top, that rumor turns into a 5-minute pause by an enemy platoon as it decides whether to hold or run. 5 minutes in the midst of a giant battle sounds small. They are not. 5 minutes compress a line, collapse a plan, and write a day's history. Not through numbers, but through preparation. Not through noise, but through timing. Not through fame, but through effect. 30 men with a script can unwrite another army's schedule. That is how 30 come to feel like 10,000. That is how fear becomes a tool. That is how a corps becomes a reputation. And when the guns fall silent and the ridge holds still, what remains is not the legend of ferocity, but the discipline that built it. 30 isn't a mystical number. It is the size of a team that can rehearse together, move together, and trust one another enough to enter darkness. That truth holds anywhere. A line depends on routine. It held on a chalk ridge in 1917, under a wet sky, in a war whose machines could be counted and whose minutes could not. The last image lingers, a line of men, faces blackened, fingers feeling for the last strand of wire. A hand on a shoulder, a 3-word whisper, the soft clack of a fuse cap. Silence before shock, work done by 30, felt by thousands. Then dawn and the larger machine turns, and the rumor becomes a plan come true.